Then we have to ask the next question. Why is it that so many people would say the double-action revolvers are the best for novice shooters? I think the answer has a lot to do with poor comparisons. First of all, one author states that the revolver is simple and that no great level of physical strength is required to use it. Then he goes on to say that an extremely weak person could fire the revolver in single action. The problem with this logic is that a revolver generally requires more strength to operate than a single action or striker-fired pistol. It is also harder to reload quickly and under stress than a pistol, which means that it is really not simpler to operate. Also, it doesn't make sense to fire a revolver slowly in single action when you could fire a pistol quickly in single action. These next two authors say that a person with a minimum of time and money would be better off investing it in a double-action revolver than the 1911. Some of the reasons for this is because 1911s allegedly have lousy sights and a bad trigger pull. This argument doesn't make that much sense to me considering the amount of revolvers that came with fixed sights that weren't very good either and had much worse triggers. Bill Wilson and Michael Bain's comments make more sense when you consider that for a long time, 1911s were not being built well. Poor quality control leads to serious problems, like a questionable ejector and poor barrel-to-feed ramp fit. Which is why they said it's foolish to risk your life to an out-of-the-box 1911. Then they go on to say that the Star PD has most of the work done from the factory that most 1911s need, including low-profile adjustable sights and a good throating job. They also say that Star PDs will almost always feed hardball, aka full metal jackets, seemingly in comparison to 1911s. Since many 1911s at this time were not that reliable, they would need a lot more work and money invested to make a good self-defense weapon. They go on to say that some of the out-of-the-box guns don't even feed full metal jackets reliably, probably due to an extractor that isn't adjusted right, as they rarely are. Some people also believe that loose fit between the parts is what gives a 1911 better reliability, and that is just not true. Tight fit between parts mainly helps reliability, but also helps accuracy. In addition, Larry Vickers explained that they did reliability tests in dirty conditions with an H&K USP, a Glock 22, and a USGI loose-fitted 1911, and a 1911 with a tighter fit between parts. The results were that the loose-fitted 1911 was inferior to the tighter 1911 in terms of reliability. The USP was the gun that did the best, and the Glock actually did the worst because the sand got into the trigger mechanism through a channel in the backstrap. Larry also said the results of the test would be very different if they had taken the chance to plug up the Glock where the sand was leaking in. On that same note, someone I know who owns Kimbers has mentioned to me that Kimber guns have tight tolerances, and that causes problems with reliability. I didn't quite understand what he was trying to say at the time because tight tolerances can't make a gun unreliable. Tolerances are essentially how closely the parts are machined to fit their specifications. What he was trying to say was that having tight clearances or very little space between the parts can cause unreliability. Obviously, Kimber is known mostly for its 1911s, and if you want an accurate 1911, you want to have a tight fit between the slide and frame, as well as a very accurate barrel. The only problem is that if the slide and frame fit is too tight, that 1911 will not be completely reliable. I'm not saying that all Kimbers have this problem, or that this is the case of all reliability problems with Kimbers. I'm saying that this is an issue that is inherent to trying to make a more accurate 1911, and this is especially true if you're trying to mass produce 1911s and not hand fit them. The part about mass manufacturing is important because, as Larry Vickers explains, the 1911 was designed in an era where it was expected that you may have to hand fit the parts together in order for it to work right. This is why you should expect that the extractor, thumb safety, and grip safety may require hand fitting or gunsmithing to work correctly. Larry Vickers says that with those three parts, it's almost guaranteed that they will need some hand fitting before they work right. More modern designs like Glocks do not require hand fitting, and they are far less finicky as far as reliability goes. Manufacturers try their best to minimize the problem with the 1911 design, and they are largely successful in doing so, obviously, otherwise no 1911s would be very reliable at all. Larry Vickers says that you have to pay more attention to maintenance, keeping the gun lubed, and what kind of ammunition and magazines you are using with the 1911. The problem with 1911s is that they require the ammunition to be pushed higher and at a steeper angle than more modern guns. This means that other guns like Glocks can reliably cycle ammunition that wouldn't work right in a 1911, so we should have different expectations of reliability for a 1911 compared to a Glock if we're being reasonable about the matter. For 1911s, it's wise to find ammunition that you know works well and magazines that you know work well, and stick with that combination. For those of you who don't know, both Larry Vickers and Bill Wilson are huge fans of the 1911, so when they criticize certain aspects of it, they're just being honest. So 1911s can be very reliable when everything is working right. It's just more likely that something isn't quite right with them than more modern designs. I think it's also pretty obvious that the reason 1911s generally cost more than polymer guns like Glocks and M&Ps is because 1911s have more time and effort put into them. Generally speaking, the higher cost ensures that the 1911 works well and that everything is put together right. Modern polymer guns get away with working well at a lower manufacturing cost. There are exceptions to this rule of higher costs, and probably the most prominent example is the Rock Island Armory 1911 made in the Philippines. From everything that I've heard, they are very good for such a low price point. With that in mind, the Rock Island 1911s may not always work with all kinds of hollow points. So the 1911s made today, generally speaking, have pretty good quality control compared to those made back in 1984 when Bill Wilson and Michael Bain wrote that book. Browning high powers weren't originally perfectly reliable with hollow points either. It wasn't until the Mark II version that was released in the 80s that they would work really reliably with hollow points, as far as I know. So, the reasons why people chose the 1911 over the high power were because of the larger caliber, American military acceptance, and the 1911's inherently better trigger. It is undeniable that guns that see military service become more popular afterward. For Americans, that really didn't apply to the high power because they didn't see much use by U.S. forces, and we care relatively little about what other countries use. Since I'm talking about military use, I wanted to mention that there is a basic logical error that some people seem to make. This is the belief that 9mm full metal jackets are significantly less effective than .45 full metal jackets, and that the introduction of hollow points is what made the calibers have more comparable effectiveness. The obvious problem with this belief is that with round-nosed, non-expanding bullets, both in .45 and in 9mm, they do very marginal damage. So the introduction of hollow points has noticeably increased the damage disparity between the calibers. This is not a theoretical thing either, as it's quite measurable. I made an admittedly unintuitive chart to show this point with numbers. As you can see, the difference in wound area between full metal jackets of 9mm and .45 is very little compared to the difference in hollow points in 9mm and .45. This misunderstanding of effectiveness comes from unproven beliefs about stopping power rather than the actual testing of bullets, or combat reports for that matter. In Bill Wilson's book about the 1911, he mentions how he got hooked on IPSC competitions by shooting a match with the Browning high power. What is interesting to me is that he never mentioned any problems with using a high power for competition, like he does with the 1911. Granted, this book is about 1911s, but you'd think it would be worth mentioning if the Browning high power's trigger was a significant limitation, as an example. So you would be right to ask the question, why would someone use the 1911 today, given all the other options? As far as I can tell, people who carry 1911s want a better out-of-the-box trigger and don't care as much about the limited capacity because they are still using standard single-stack 1911s, even though the double-stack 1911s are available today. 1911s are also pretty narrow, but if width was the defining factor, then there would be other single-stack guns that would also be more popular. People also get 1911s for other reasons, like a really good deal or because of the military history. These other reasons may have to do more with the circumstances or the person's love of firearms than a single-minded desire to have the most highly optimized handgun for self-defense possible. People also say that 1911s are inherently accurate, and that's not quite how I would put it. First of all, there is no specific feature that makes it more accurate than other guns. For example, if you have a design with a fixed barrel, you could rightly argue that that design is inherently more accurate than a Browning-style tilting breech gun due to the fact that the barrel is consistently in the same place every time you fire the gun. For example, it has been noticed that revolvers that have fixed barrels can be twice as accurate as a pistol with a tilting breech when both are bought from the same manufacturer. Second of all, if someone builds a 1911 well and invests more money into using good parts, it can obviously be much more accurate than other guns, just as long as you take care of it. The 1911s that did not have a great deal of quality control and used just average parts may only be of average accuracy. An accurized 1911 is sort of like an accurized M14, in that it was never designed to be a weapon intended for extremely precise shooting, yet people want it to be that. 1911s were meant to be general issue weapons meant for combat accuracy, and the military stopped using both the 1911 and the M14, as they were essentially obsolete for use when compared to other options. So, is the potential for better accuracy, better trigger, with the downsides of limited capacity and somewhat limited reliability, is this all worth it? The general trend is to move towards polymer striker-fired guns, so most people seem to think that the advantages of the 1911 are not worth it. Perhaps one of the reasons for this is the availability of drop-in or aftermarket higher quality triggers made for polymer striker-fired guns. Another problem is that many people don't have high enough skill to notice that one gun is much more accurate than another. Until you get that person to the point where they are shooting better, any argument about getting them to use a more accurate gun is essentially useless. On that note, I feel like I should mention iron sights. Bill Wilson mentioned that he was determined to use Smith & Wesson sights on his 1911s, but no matter how hard he tried, he just wasn't getting the performance he wanted from his guns. After he switched to a slide that had Bomar sights, he said that his shooting dramatically improved overnight. The Bomar sights simply had a better sight picture. I would say this sort of thing would not matter as much to a novice, especially if they intend to carry a gun for self-defense, and not compete with it at a longer range. Likewise, there is a difference between combat sights and target sights. Combat sights are on the majority of handguns today, and they have a large front sight post, where target sights have a small front sight and a smaller notch in the rear sight. Obviously, target-style sights are more of an advantage and give more precision when shooting at longer ranges, at both targets and when you are hunting. However, a smaller post is definitely not necessary for self-defense at close ranges, and it could be a hindrance. A large front sight allows your brain to identify the front sight faster. Your eyes can see both styles of sights at the same speed because that's how vision and light works, but it takes longer for your brain to identify that the smaller sight post is what you should be looking at because it's simply less noticeable. It can also take longer to gain proper sight alignment with the target sights because the rear sight can easily obscure the front post. Then there is the question of the color of the sights. Bill Wilson says that if you add colors or lines or dots to the sights, this prevents you from getting a precise sight picture. He doesn't really explain why this was, but I would assume that he is talking about putting colored dots on the sights, for example. While colored dots make the sights stand out more if you focus on the round sights instead of the squarish posts themselves, then your sight picture is less precise because you are ignoring the edges of the posts. Apparently there is a perception with colored front sights in that when the sun changes angles, your perception of the sights changes as well. The point of impact change can be as much as 4 inches at 50 yards. This is much less of a problem with black on black sights, and is basically no problem at close ranges where self-defense situations usually take place. So back when Bill Wilson and Michael Bain published this book, almost all competitors were using black on black sights. White on white 3-dot iron sights are very common today due to the fact that they are not overly expensive and that they are easier to see under low light than black on black sights. With all of that in mind, I want to also say that if you have any kind of iron sights already, it makes sense to me that you just paint the front and rear sight posts white. This completely negates the imprecise sight picture argument because it's still the same sight picture as black on black is. Likewise, if you use matte white paint, it shouldn't be excessively reflective in bright sun, and it will be easier to see in low light than other colors like red or green. If the sun is bright enough that glare is a problem, then you'd be wearing sunglasses anyway, wouldn't you? When a friend showed me his gun with a fiber optic front sight on it, I was greatly impressed on how quickly it draws your focus to the sight. The first thing I wanted to know, though, is how well does it work in the darkness? Since the pistol already had a white light attached to it, I turned it on in a dark closet. I quickly realized that the fiber optic was not as noticeable in dim light as it was in bright light. However, in my opinion, a white light and a fiber optic front sight are better both in bright light and in low light than just tritium sights. The obvious reason is because fiber optics are more noticeable in bright light, and you can easily identify targets in low light with the flashlight, where you might not be able to do so if your only light source is the tritium sights. This is extremely important if you have to clearly see a weapon before you can justify shooting an assailant. If you are hunting in low light and you cannot use a flashlight, then tritium sights would make much more sense than fiber optics because they are brighter and self-illuminated. For self-defense, having a round fiber optic front sight really doesn't matter because, again, you are not making precise long-range shots like you might be if you were competing or hunting. I'm Info Gunvault. I'm known for my articulate, detailed, and analytical approach. I dispel myths, talk about how you can avoid being attacked by angry bears, and I cover many gun-related topics. I've done a great deal of research for my videos, which is why I have hundreds of pages of notes and quotations. I'd like you to come along for the ride with me in my relentless pursuit of the truth.